Today we are going to talk about guns, specifically pistols, and more specifically inexpensive pocket pistols made in the Los Angeles area. There is a lot to learn about these highly politicized handguns. Many millions were made, and they often show up as the villains in mass media coverage of firearms or crime. Since they are simple designs, crudely made, and offer few extras other firearms offer, many shooters shy away from these as they do not hold up well to heavy range or recreational use. So not surprisingly, while researching it was difficult to find much open-minded coverage or discussion about these firearms. We will look at some of the relationships between the firearms, the people that build them, their companies, and other factors that make up this complicated and interesting facet of United States firearms history. As a disclaimer, all of our research was done online in an honest attempt to better understand firearms history here in the U.S. It's not an attempt to offer legal advice. We offer this strictly for educational and entertainment purposes. We need to begin where much firearms research begins, with the great John Moses Browning. Of course, entire books have been written about him, and we'll still need many more to cover all the inventions and ideas he left us with. The few that we'll concentrate on here will be the 25 ACP cartridge and his vest pocket pistols. At the turn of the last century, Browning decided it was time for the 25 auto, and so it became. In 1905, he invented the cartridge and the pistol to go along with it, the FN Model 1906, and soon after the US version, the Colt Model 1908. These very popular pocket pistols have a history of their own, as they are each over 100 years old. These were invented to meet a demand, and they did so successfully for over a century, and many other small pistols followed. This is where our story begins, but now we'll stop and take a look in another direction towards United States firearms law. In 1968, the Gun Control Act was passed. It became the third largest federal firearms policy, surpassed only by the 1934 NFA and, of course, the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The GCA became Title I of the U.S. federal firearms law, and the NFA became Title II. This is essentially U.S. federal law that regulates the firearms industry. It does this by regulating interstate commerce and prohibiting any transfers of firearms across state lines unless through a licensed dealer. The GCA also added a sporting purposes qualifier which regulated the importation of certain firearms. The Gun Control Act of 1968 is also where we get the 10 restrictions on firearms ownership, along with the creation of the FFL licensing system, the requirement for serial numbers on firearms, prohibitions on age, direct ordering, and even the assembly of firearms. But the part of the 1968 Gun Control Act that we will concentrate on here for purposes of this research is the ATF Form 4590. The 4590 is the importation guidelines that limit what types of firearms can be brought into the United States for resale. Let's take a closer look at that form. This is the actual factoring criteria for any handgun being imported into the United States. The column on the left is for pistols, the column on the right is for revolvers. Now each firearm must meet enough characteristics deemed necessary by the 1968 Gun Control Act to reach a total of 75 points on their chart. If a firearm cannot meet these criteria, it's not able to be imported. Now looking even closer at the criteria for importing a pistol, you'll see that there's only a possible 100 or so points if you count everything on the list, which means there are only about 25 points worth of characteristics that can be adjusted in order for a firearm to qualify. And if you look even closer at the math, a pistol with the caliber less than 9mm automatically loses 10 points, and if it's a single action, it loses another 10. So as you can see, it's all but impossible for a simple, small caliber pocket pistol to be imported with these restrictions in place. And many people suggest that's how it was designed to be. Now, without debating on other topics here, we'll concentrate on the repercussions of its passage, the decrease in supply of small pocket pistols here in the U.S. Now the conditions had been set in place with federal legislation, how did the free market react? A Detroit police captain in the 1960s named them Saturday Night Specials. Characterized by low cost, small size, and light caliber, these low-end firearms have been the target of anti-gun organizations as well as most mainstream news and media since the 1960s and 70s. Since these firearms are on the low end of the spectrum, they don't get much respect, attention, or even defense from firearms enthusiasts either. Now, the first wave of these low-end handguns were the subject of great debate and news coverage in the early 60s, and those early Saturday Night Specials were mostly imported from Europe until importation was halted in 1968. While there were many new U.S.-made Saturday Night Specials being built around the country to fill the demand, far more were made in Los Angeles than anywhere else. An emergency room doctor and anti-gun crusader in the LA area coined the phrase "Ring of Fire" to describe his displeasure about the many firearms manufacturers located within an hour of downtown Los Angeles. Let's take a closer look at these Ring of Fire manufacturers on a map of LA in the order they came to be. At first glance it seems like a lot of companies, because there are a lot of them, and it may seem a little complicated because many of them have operated from more than one location. We have truly just scratched the surface of a very elaborate and interesting history of the people, companies, and firearms of the Ring of Fire. Let's go a little deeper and look at it from a different direction. Everything started in 1970 with Raven Arms and its founder, George Jennings. In 1978, his son Bruce left Raven Arms to create his own company called Jennings Firearms. Bruce designed a smaller pistol based off his father's Raven P25, but scaled it down for the smaller .22 long rifle. Both companies existed, selling inexpensive firearms without directly competing with each other. Then in 1982, George Jennings' daughter Gail and his office manager at Raven Arms, Jim Davis, who were married, started their own company called Davis Industries. They created another version of the Raven P25, this time scaled up for the .32 ACP and later the .380. They also manufactured some inexpensive Derringers designed by George Jennings. They all built similar pistols, but each company had its own share of the market, and they each sold a lot of firearms. In 1984, the one and only improvement was made to the Raven P25, and the new model, MP25, continued to be the one pistol Raven made until the factory burned down in 1991. The AMT backup was also introduced in 1984. The AMT was always included with the Ring of Fire manufacturers, but was totally independent of Raven Arms, the Jennings family, and they built their firearms differently. In 1987, Jim Davis' brother, John, who had worked at both Raven Arms and Davis Industries, started his own company called Sedco. However, he was not in business very long and was sued by both Jennings and his brother, and he soon went out of business. In 1985, divorce and possible legal issues led George's son Bruce to restructure his business, and Bryco Arms was created. In 1988, George Jennings' nephew started Sundance Industries with an upgraded version of his uncle's MP25, this time with a grip safety and a laser sight. In 1989, one of Bruce Jennings' old friends, Jim Waldorf, started Lorcin Engineering, which was the first direct competition with the Raven and its hybrids. Jim Waldorf hired Jim Davis's brother John from Sedco. In 1991, the Raven Arms factory burned down, George Jennings retired, and a new company called Phoenix Arms was created by his family to continue building the MP25 as the Raven model. In 1998, Jim Davis started Republic Arms and built a new .45 ACP pistol with a polymer frame. Only a few were made, and the company soon went out of business. In 1999, Jim Waldorf started Standard Arms with his first version of a polymer frame pistol, and it did not succeed very well. Later in 2000, he started Talon Industries with another model of a polymer frame. In 2001, Cobra Industries bought the tooling and rights to build the Davis Industries pistols and Derringers. Cobra continues to build them to this day. In 2004, Jimenez Arms was created by Paul Jimenez, who was the general manager of Bryco Arms. JA bought the tooling and rights to the Bryco Arms, the Jennings line, and still manufactures those to this day. At first glance, this might seem fairly complicated, but you'll always have this chart to help map it out. One of the reasons the Ring of Fire manufacturers are so interesting is the number of ways one can look at the relationships between them. Let's take another run through this chart, this time from another perspective. George Jennings created Raven Arms. His son Bruce created Jennings Firearms. George's daughter Gail and her husband Jim Davis created Davis Industries. AMT was not part of the family but made a comparable product, so it's often included. Sedco was started by Jim Davis' brother, who worked at both Raven Arms and Davis Industries and would later work for Jim Waldorf at Lorcin Engineering. When George's son Bruce got divorced from his wife Janice, Bryco Arms was created and run by Janice. The Bryco Arms pistols were distributed by Bruce at Jennings Firearms. Stephen Jennings was George Jennings' nephew. Stephen started Sundance Industries. His firearms were also distributed by Bruce at Jennings Firearms. Now, Bruce Jennings' high school friend, Jim Waldorf, started Lorcin Engineering, and while technically not related to the Jennings, Lorcin and its products were a major part of the Ring of Fire phenomenon. When the Raven Arms factory burned down, Phoenix Arms was created, and while it's not clear, research indicates that Phoenix Arms is now owned by many of George Jennings' extended family. Republic Arms was the first attempt made at a polymer frame pistol by Jim Davis, George's son-in-law, while Standard Arms and Talon Industries were Jim Waldorf's ventures into polymer frame pistols. After lawsuits closed down Davis Industries, Cobra Industries bought their equipment and rights to continue their firearm lines. Similarly, when lawsuits threatened Bryco Arms, Jimenez Arms was formed to carry on the Bryco and Jennings lines. Most reporting of the Ring of Fire manufacturers will describe this close-knit extended family business structure as inbreeding, coercion, collusion, and worse. So it's difficult to truly understand the course of events throughout those years. However, it is possible to chart them as we've done here. But now let's get back to the guns. Let's get rid of the dates, and this time let's concentrate on the lineages. The Ring of Fire pistols can all trace their roots to the P25, which had only one major design in its 20 years and 2 to 3 million pistol production run. When the Raven Arms factory burned down, Phoenix Arms rose from the ashes, and the M&P 25 lived on as the Raven model from Phoenix Arms. The first major branch in the lineage from the Raven P25 is Bruce's Jennings J25, a slimmed-down version of his father's pistol designed for the .22 long rifle. The next branch in the family tree are the Davis Industries models, which are the Raven pistol beefed up for the larger .32 ACP and .380 ACP cartridges. Sundance Industries pistols are an upgraded Raven MP25 with grip safeties and laser sights. Bryco Arms eventually made their versions of the MP25 for Jennings Firearms, which lives on today as the JA25 from Jimenez Arms, as do some of the other Bryco models. Davis Industries firearms live on today as Cobra Industries models. And since we don't have the entire catalog from each company to work with here on the screen, we'll just mention that this is just the tip of the iceberg when you get into the technical details of how these pistols operate. The lineages of these inexpensive pistols really ties them together in complex ways. Now let's focus on each of the companies and what makes them unique in the Ring of Fire story. We know that Raven Arms was the original, founded by George Jennings, an aerospace engineer, who saw an open market for inexpensive firearms artificially caused by a Gun Control Act of 1968. He created the Raven Arms P25, a .25 ACP pocket pistol, and with that began the story of the Ring of Fire manufacturers. Jennings Firearms was the next company to be created by George's son, Bruce Jennings. He scaled down the Raven P25 to .22 long rifle. Jennings Firearms has a long and complicated history of name changes, multiple locations, and eventually becoming a distributor rather than a manufacturer. Davis Industries, which was run by George Jennings' daughter and son-in-law Jim Davis. Jim had worked with George at Raven Arms as his office manager. Davis Industries pistols are scaled-up versions of the Raven P25 for use with larger calibers. While Davis Industries was one of the most prolific producers of inexpensive pocket pistols in the U.S. throughout the 80s and 90s, it was also a target of lawsuits, and like many of the Ring of Fire manufacturers, it was all but sued out of existence eventually. Arcadia Machine and Tool, or AMT, was no relations to the Jennings family, but it was in close proximity and made a similar product, so it has always been included with the Ring of Fire phenomenon. However, the AMT product line included many firearms that had no similarity to Saturday Night Specials. AMT was eventually sold and resold, and now some of their models are available through High Standard. CalWestCo is an interesting facet of this story, and one that makes understanding the relationships between the companies more difficult. In 1985, Bruce Jennings divorced his second wife Janice after a domestic violence incident. Because a domestic violence arrest can put a federal firearms license in jeopardy, Bruce decided to reorganize his company to avoid potential complications. CalWestCo was created and run by Gene Johnson, the office manager from Jennings Firearms. While it's difficult to research the specifics, the new company, CalWestCo, and later Bryco, were the manufacturers for Jennings Firearms, which eventually became a distributor instead of a manufacturer. In 1987, John Davis created Sedco Industries. John had worked at Raven Arms as a machine operator, then left to work with his brother Jim when he created Davis Industries. The brothers did not get along well, and John left to start Sedco, creating a .22 caliber pistol designed to compete with the Jennings J22. However, Sedco only lasted a short time as John was sued by the Jennings family and his own brother. Later, John would work for Lorcin Engineering. In 1988, or some sources say 1992, Bryco Arms was created to build guns for Jennings Firearms. Bryco was named after Bruce Jennings' son, Brian, who was George's grandson. Bryco Arms was run by Janice Jennings and manufactured models based on the Jennings and Raven MP25 with Bruce's upgrades and improvements. In 2003, Bryco was the focus of a lawsuit. A 12-year-old babysitter was unloading a Bryco pistol and pulled the trigger with the round still in the firearm. He shot a 7-year-old named Brandon Maxfield in the neck. We will talk more about Brandon later, but for now, Bryco Arms was left facing a $24 million record settlement against them. Bryco Arms went bankrupt. In 2004, Paul Jimenez, who was the foreman at Bryco Arms, bought the equipment and rights to continue building the Bryco model pistols. Sundance Industries was short-lived, direct branch off the Raven Arms family tree. Sundance was owned by Stephen Jennings, who was George's nephew, and his major improvement to the Raven MP25 was a grip safety and a laser sight option. Lorcin Engineering is another key player in the ring of fire manufacturers and has only an indirect relationship with the Jennings family. Jim Waldorf started Lorcin in 1989 and produced handguns in multiple calibers from .22 long rifle to 9mm. Although Jim shared similar perspectives on producing inexpensive firearms for the masses, he did not work directly with the Jennings family on any major products. Lorcin Engineering was plagued with its share of problems, none of which helped the reputation of the ring of fire manufacturers. Theft by employees, lawsuits by customers, and lousy reviews by firearms enthusiasts all led to the eventual downfall of Lorcin Engineering. Phoenix Arms rose from the ashes of the Raven Arms factory fire, only in a different location. And although it's not easy to research, it seems that the Jennings family runs the show at Phoenix Arms. Their line of products has been reduced to 2 models, but they're still making inexpensive firearms today. And Phoenix Arms is one of the 3 remaining companies producing the original Ring of Fire products. Republic Arms, created by Jim Davis, only lasted a short time. They produced less than 1,000 Patriot 45 pistols in 45 ACP using a polymer frame. While Jim was developing the Patriot 45, Jim Waldorf started Standard Arms and later Talon Industries with his attempts at polymer-framed inexpensive pistols, neither of which were a success. None of these 3 companies lasted more than a year. Although these last 3 companies were never included in the Ring of Fire hype that was created in the news stories in the 1990s, they are part of the Ring's lineage. Depending on how you see it, you might think companies that last only a year with experimental products which failed were pushed onto the market by greedy, uncaring capitalists wishing to make a dollar from the blood of the masses. Or alternatively, you might see entrepreneurship, new materials technology, innovation, and free market forces at work. The last 2 companies we'll focus on were never part of the Ring of Fire manufacturers. However, they are descendants of those original companies and offer their products for sale today. Cobra Enterprises purchased the machinery and design rights from Davis Industries and produces some of their pistol models along with their Derringers. Cobra also offers new models of the Talon Industries pistols. Jimenez Arms was created by Paul Jimenez in 2004 after buying the equipment and design rights from Bryco Arms. After unsuccessful safety testing in California, JA moved to Nevada. JA offers both Jennings, Bryco, and their own firearms models for sale. Well, there's a rundown of the Ring of Fire manufacturers and some of the ways they relate to each other. With the volume of information and the complex ways it interrelates to each other, it seemed beneficial to graph it in various ways. Looking at the same information from various angles helps to tell the story. Here's a chart that would have taken forever to research before we offered it here in one place. Here is the same chart laying out that relationship between the various companies' pistols. And here's much of the same information in a timeline form. Here's that same information arranged differently to show the lineages of the particular product lines. And yet another timeline with some added events for reference. We are about to talk about the media's influence on the Ring of Fire, and this timeline helps illustrate those mainstream media articles happened to occur around the introduction of the Brady Bill and the 1994 assault weapons ban. It's also a time when polymer frame pistols were being developed and coming into the market in volume. We don't mean to indicate that there's a cause and effect relationship with these other events, but it is interesting to see their proximity on a calendar. This is where most of the firearm research ends, but the politics, legalities, and discussion don't stop here. Any discussion of the Ring of Fire firearms manufacturers will need to cover the topic of lawsuits. While this may not be the most interesting aspect of the Ring of Fire, and we will only briefly touch on it here, it certainly is a dramatic aspect and worthy of a closer look. Let's look at the case of Brandon Maxfield versus Bryco Arms. In 1994, when Brandon Maxfield was 7 years old, his 12-year-old babysitter shot him in the face with a Bryco pistol. This was an accident while the babysitter was attempting to unload the pistol. However, being unfamiliar with the controls of the gun, and obviously in violation of the 4 basic gun safety rules, Brandon was injured and is paralyzed from the neck down. 9 years later, after a 2-month trial, a record judgment of $24 million was granted to Brandon against Bruce Jennings, Bryco Arms, and Jennings Firearms. The verdict was entirely for compensatory damages. No punitive damages were sought. All those named in the lawsuit, along with various trusts and partnerships controlled by the Jennings and the other companies involved in the settlement, filed for bankruptcy the day after the trial. 2 years later, in 2005, the Bryco factory equipment was for sale in bankruptcy court. Paul Jimenez, the factory manager from Bryco Arms, started the bidding at $150,000. However, Brandon had waged an online campaign to raise funds in order to buy the Bryco Arms factory. Brandon raised the bidding to over $500,000. While Paul Jimenez eventually was successful and won the auction at $510,000, the inflated price was somewhat of a victory for Brandon. Now, whether or not you feel a $24 million judgment was appropriate, and no matter what side of the debate you come down on over manufacturer's liability, I think we can all agree that Brandon has been successful in his endeavors. On the other side of the debate, but still in the legal discussion, is Jason Davis, grandson of George Jennings, who worked as a firearms manufacturer and later earned his law degree from Loyola Law School. It's interesting to see how the legal fires encountered by the Ring of Fire companies have forged lawyers of their own. It's good to know that there's lawyers out there on the pro-gun side of things, too. Any comprehensive discussion of the Ring of Fire manufacturers must include the news articles of the 1990s, which created the hype and call to arms against them. These 3 articles are cited almost exclusively in any basic coverage of the topic since their initial publication 20 years ago. The first journalist to bring attention to a perceived problem with small, easily concealable, inexpensive firearms in Southern California was Alix Freedman of the Wall Street Journal in 1992. While I may not agree with her opinions, I will give her credit for putting feet on the ground, conducting interviews with the key players, and putting in the work for her story. While I may not have been able to locate the entire story verbatim, I have been able to read enough direct quotes from her story to feel as though I've read the whole thing. The second most cited reference to this subject is a 1994 research paper from the doctor who coined the term Ring of Fire. The complete text is available from multiple sources online. The doctor directly quotes much of the Alix Freedman Firepower article of 2 years prior. The 100-page-long Ring of Fire research paper goes into great detail on a myriad of subjects related to the firearms of the Ring of Fire manufacturers and how Dr. Winnemute sees their relationship to crime nationwide. In addition to the Ring of Fire research paper he is now famous for, Dr. Winnemute is a prolific author of anti-gun literature. Reading through some of his interpretations and conclusions can be very frustrating to someone who is aware of how firearms operate, or anyone involved in the firearms community. Perhaps because the doctor is so far removed from the recreational use of firearms, he has a very pessimistic opinion of their use and place in society. Third, and perhaps the most viewed news source about the Ring of Fire manufacturers is the 1997 PBS Frontline episode, Hot Guns. The complete transcript of the episode is available online, as well as many interactive extra features which make learning about the subject quite interesting. However, the Frontline episode is almost completely researched from Dr. Winnemute's 1994 research paper, which is of course heavily quoted the 1992 Alix Freedman article from the Wall Street Journal. So while researching this information, I was impressed with the amount of reference that was done without further research. In fact, most sources of current information about the Ring of Fire manufacturers directly quotes one of those 3 articles. And as we see, these articles reference that initial research done by Alix Freedman. It would be curious to see someone follow up all these years later. I doubt we'll see an impartial follow-up anytime soon. Lastly, I will mention briefly Gun Test Magazine. It may be worthwhile to note that almost every anti-Saturday Night Special article that I've discovered in my research cites that Ring of Fire research paper, which devotes an entire section to the unreliability of these firearms, determined by reviews from Gun Test Magazine. So while I'm sure the crotchety old gun writers who published those reviews may have had nothing better to say about low-end firearms than I might have, the difference between us is I am not cited in dozens, if not hundreds, of anti-gun articles as expert testimony to the fact that these firearms are unsafe in anyone's hands. What I mean to say is be responsible for what you put out there. In conclusion, I will admit I've changed my mind on these inexpensive firearms. Just a few weeks ago, they would have never crossed my mind twice. Now I see them in a different light. I don't mean to suggest that the media hype is responsible for all their shortcomings. However, their less than favorable reputation is not 100% attributable to the people who designed them, the companies who manufactured them, the gun themselves, or the actions of the people who use them. Instead, there are some complex interactions taking place that make for some interesting research, discussion, and potentially a new area of collecting. Their place in firearms history will no doubt be an important one. Legally, if we decide these guns have no sporting use and let them be regulated out of existence, then where does that slippery slope end? Requiring manufacturers, distributors, retailers, and customers to justify why they want a product is another potential slippery slope. We urge you, don't ignore interesting facets of our firearms history. Research the facts for yourself and share them. Consider collecting these fragments of history. Where do you draw the line in the sand on what firearms are okay? Defending the Saturday Night Special is defending the right to own a non-sporting firearm. We thank you for watching our presentation of this research. Please let us know what you think. Feel free to ask questions, leave comments or concerns. We've referenced our sources at the end of the document. We encourage you to do your own research and share it with others. You can find other information like this on our websites. We thank you for your support. And as always, thank you for watching.
The guys and gals of GunWebsites.com encourage you to take a CCW class every year, practice at least once a month, and carry every day. Thanks for watching GunWebsites.com.